Good morning, and can I welcome everyone to this, the fourth meeting of the Standards, Procedure and Public Appointments Committee in 2025. I've received apologies from Ruth Maguire this morning, but can I welcome Rona Mackay, who is attending as committee substitute. Our first agenda item for the committee is a decision on taking matters subsequent to this morning in private. They are a discussion on the evidence that we are about to hear, a discussion on proposed code of conduct rule changes, and also a note by the clerks in relation to the Lobbying Scotland Act. Are members content to take that in private? Yes. Good. Our second item today is to take evidence on the committee effectiveness inquiry. Our inquiry is seeking to answer the question: are there changes to the Parliament's procedures and practices which would help committees to work more effectively? In recent weeks, we've launched a public call for views on the inquiry, and we've also invited consultation responses from committees, the Scottish Parliament corporate body, political parties, and also individual MSPs. We've also written to a range of legislatures to ask for information on how their committees operate and evaluate their work. And today is the first in a series of 4 oral evidence sessions on our inquiry. And we are this morning joined by the committee inquiry advisor, Dr. Daniel Bezic, who sits to my right. Today we're going to try and explore and answer this overarching question: how are committees viewed externally, and how do you evaluate their impact? This morning, I'm grateful to welcome Gemma Diamond, who's Director of Innovation and Transformation, Audit Scotland, Dr. Mark Geddes, Senior Lecturer in Politics, University of Edinburgh, Sir David Naslia, KCB, Clerk to the House of Commons between 2015 and 2019, Clerk to the Committees between 2008-2009, and Clerk to the House of Commons Reform Committee, known as the Right Committee, between 2009 and 2010. Brian Taylor, former political editor at BBC Scotland, but also a columnist in The Herald and long-time observer of this Parliament, and Professor Meg Russell, Director of the Constitution Unit at the University College London. This is a roundtable evidence session, and whilst there is the usual approach of questions from members to witness, we are trying to seek the opportunity for witnesses to discuss between themselves and have a more open and free-flowing evidence session than perhaps sometimes occurs in committees. There's no expectation of the witnesses to answer all questions, and for those witnesses who are appearing remotely that wish to respond to a question or comment, if you can type R in the chat function or just jump in. I'm now going to move to the first of the facilitating questions, which is about the characteristics of a successful committee. So, Sue Webber, can I hand over to you?
Thanks, Convener. I suppose I'll be asking Dr. Geddes' first question, so you can, but it doesn't mean that it's just with all the work that you've done in this sort of field. I was wondering if you might be able to think about what would be the most significant factors that make a committee effective.
Yeah, thanks very much for the invitation, first of all, to be here. I'm really, really grateful to have this opportunity to be able to impart some of my research. So thank you very much. It's a great opening question, and there's lots of different ways to approach effectiveness generally. In terms of ingredients, I suppose there's lots of things to say, so I'll just give a few thoughts, and then hopefully some other witnesses can also jump in. The first thing that I would say very broadly is that a lot of it depends on the willingness, interest and motivation of the committee convener and also the members to make committees effective. I think that's the most important thing. And that essentially means a willingness for cross-party working is one of the biggest hallmarks that I've noticed in Westminster when I studied select committees. This willingness amongst all members to try to sort of leave their party badges at the door for committee hearings, both in private and in public, to try to work together. In order to do that, everyday behaviours, I think, are really, really important. So getting to know each other is absolutely fundamental as people, not just as politicians. I think that's really important. And trying to understand where different MSPs are coming from with their work, the aims that they have, and what they want to achieve by being on the committee, which has, of course, lots of laudable aims. So I think that's really important. And small things like committee visits can be really useful in those settings to bring people's sort of views out where they can spontaneously interact more commonly. So I think that sort of, on a personal level, I think those things are really, really fundamental. And the second thing that I would say is that also the structures and procedures also matter and are really important. So the system that's used for appointing conveners and members sort of gives sort of a strong underpinning for how people will then behave in terms of the kind of role that they think that they have. And I'm sure that we will talk about that a little bit later on. And other structural factors such as the size of committees, the makeup of committees also really matter, as well as the processes that they have for gathering sort of robust evidence as part of their processes. I think those sorts of things are also really important.
Can I pick up on one tiny little bit of that? You mentioned about what would the members' intention being when they become a member of that committee, when often, to be frank, we are appointed to that committee. And so do you think that is a bit of a conflict in terms, or no, that might cause an issue where we might not necessarily have an interest in that committee, we are just appointed to it by our party processes?
I wouldn't say necessarily a conflict, but it does change the dynamic in terms of what you're trying to do on the committee, or the level of interest that you might have in sort of pursuing the aims that the committee might have. So I think it does matter in that sense, yes.
Online, do either of the witnesses online, Professor or Sir David, want to... Sir David.
Yeah. Well, as I will probably keep saying, I agree with... Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
You can. Sorry, we're looking. I will agree with Mark. But I think your question about if you're just appointed, and I don't ask how you get to join this important committee, but if you haven't volunteered, your enthusiasm is likely to be rather less, which is one of the reasons that the Right Committee suggested that the members should be elected by the party groups. Now, being realistic, there are sometimes vacancies for which nobody comes forward. And I think we all know that that's politics. And people think, well, I'm afraid you've got to do your time on the SPAB Associated Bodies Committee before you get on to the one you really want to get onto. So, one mustn't be unrealistic about members absolutely desperate to spend their time talking about procedure and privileges and so on. But it's a duty, you're not there for fun. So the single point, I think a test is, can the committee express, when it embarks on an inquiry, or indeed on a 4 or 5 year programme, can it express what it expects to come out? In other words, you should write on a bit of paper, look, I'll be realistic, this is what we hope to get out of this inquiry or this activity. We don't have to publicise what we expect. Maybe we're just doing it because we feel we should, and we have low expectations of any output of value, but it has to be done. But you should know where you're going before you start off.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to flip...
Sorry, I think Professor Meg Russell, did you want to come in on that point?
Yeah, if you're happy for me to come in. Yeah?
Yes.
Maybe I could just preface very briefly what I say with a tiny biographical note, just to emphasise that I was actually the specialist advisor to the Select Committee on the Reform of the House of Commons, which David was the clerk to. So that might be worth bearing in mind. In terms of the question about effectiveness, it is a really good and really big and complicated question, actually, because I think it depends on how you define effectiveness, doesn't it? There are lots of different effects that committees can have, which are very varied, I think. Another bit of sort of why I'm here, I suppose, is that I did a large project. It's quite a long time ago now. The report was published in 2011 on the House of Commons Select Committees, looking at their policy impact. It was a large piece of work because we looked at 7 committees. We looked at over 1,900 recommendations and traced whether they'd been accepted and whether they'd been implemented and what the pattern of that was, which was quite interesting. But a big part of what we concluded was that actually you can't entirely measure committee effectiveness that way. It's interesting to know how many recommendations are accepted and crucially subsequently implemented. But we might come on to talk about that in terms of some of the risks of that measure. But one of the most important things we more importantly than what we said about the level of acceptance of recommendations was all of the other effects that committees can have. So in terms of, and Mark, I totally agree with what Mark just said, and he also put some of this in his written evidence, gathering together evidence and putting it in front of the Parliament, in front of the public, in front of the media, questioning ministers, putting them on the spot on difficult things. And crucially, I think, changing the broader culture in the Parliament, particularly if you are able to get a culture of evidence-based working and cross-party working in your committees, then that has a much wider impact on the entire culture of the Parliament, how people work together in plenary, how they're perceived by the public. The committees can have a really profound influence on the overall culture of the Parliament. I also agree, as somebody who teaches comparative politics, that there are various attributes, and we might discuss them a bit more, which are commonly associated in the comparative literature with effective committees around their size, their permanence. One of the things I know you're interested in is shadowing government departments. Generally, the literature suggests that committees are most effective when they're matched up with the structure of government departments. And another thing that's emphasised that I know is on your agenda in the Scottish Parliament is low turnover. Having members who are there for a while, who get to know each other, get to know the subject, and so on. And then other things like resourcing, how you take evidence, lots of things associated in the literature with effectiveness.
And I know we will pick those up. Brian, do you want to come in?
Just briefly express my tiny apprehension at sitting here. I've interviewed most of you, and this is your chance for revenge. I think is one thing. That point that's made there about permanence is I think, a very good one. When a minister sits here, they do so all alone, totally solitary, except for the umpteen thousand civil servants that are behind them, able to give them advice and guidance. And if you are to counter that or question that, you require to develop a degree of expertise in your own right. I look back at the CSG report. It was chaired by Henry McLeish prior to the establishment of this Parliament. It talked about permanent committees, all-purpose committees combining Westminster Select and Standing, and it said this would enable members to develop an expertise in particular areas and to bring an informed view to the consideration of legislation and scrutiny of the executive. And I think you've done that relatively successfully with a degree of almost collective determination to get to the substance of the issue before you. I mean, basically, parliaments do three things. They legislate, they hold the governing executive to account, and the third one, perhaps the most important of all, they ventilate issues of concern to the people they serve. And I think the committee system has done that relatively well. Where it falls down is where it departs from the CSG principle of forming a permanent standing inquisitorial and questioning agenda with the governing executive and on behalf of the people. Just to say, for example, I don't suppose the Dundee University team will readily forget their appearance before the committee yesterday, and that was a job well done.
And that was one of the things to follow up, is like one of the significant barriers to committee effectiveness. I think it was drawn out by yourselves, Sir David and Professor Russell, on the time pressures that we have. And I know there's, having been convener on Education Committee, and the legislation that's thrown at you that you need to accommodate, and then there's no space for that reactive work, which would include, for example, what happened in Dundee University. So what, in terms of other barriers, and maybe expanding a little bit more on that element of the time constraints, can I come online first to see if you've got any reflections on the barriers there? Professor Russell first, perhaps?
Sure. I mean, one thing that's the place that I know the most about is Westminster, notwithstanding my comparative experience. And I have to say, I know very little about the way that your committees work, so forgive me if I say anything that's naive in that regard. But there's quite a striking kind of irony around the select committees in the House of Commons in particular, although they exist in the Lords as well. They're very widely seen as the kind of jewel in the crown of Westminster. You know, people complain about a lot of things about the House of Commons, but they generally hold up the select committees as being one of the most effective parts of the institution. They appreciate the fact that they're cross-party, expert, etc. One of the things I think that makes the select committees so effective, I suppose, if I can reuse that word, is that they have relatively little power. They have effectively practically no power, actually, and therefore They are largely left alone by the whips. They can build cross-party bonds. They can set their own agendas. They can get on with what they want without too much partisan interference. And crucially, part of that is that they don't look at legislation. So obviously, you have committees which are, I do know this much, that they're in line with most other committee systems around the world in that you conduct legislative scrutiny and also sort of broader inquiry work within the same setting. And I think it's very common in committees around the world that the reactive work, the work that arrives with you from the government or from the chamber, crowds out the work that you might sort of voluntarily do yourselves and wish to prioritise yourselves. The select committees in the House of Commons don't have that because they don't look at legislation. They're not, generally they don't. They certainly don't take the committee stage of legislation, which is taken in a completely different set of committees. So they're really inquiry committees which set their own agendas, and they have very little power, and therefore they can spend time on that stuff. They do really good inquiries, they produce really good reports, and they work very effectively cross-party. It's hard to see how you replicate that, but I do wonder, with respect to your system, whether a greater use perhaps of inquiry committees which are not caught up so much with the legislative process might actually allow some different kinds of work to develop. But I don't know how your work goes sort of sufficiently well to dictate upon that. But I did read that, for example, you were thinking of setting up 2 justice committees. And I don't know whether that would mean that one of them would be allowed to do sort of proactive work rather than constantly reacting to what's being thrown at it by the executive.
Sir David?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, at the very beginning, Scottish Parliament, I think, inevitable decision for Henry McLeish and the working groups 30 years ago to combine scrutiny in a general sense with the legislative work. In other words, I think it had no choice. Can you hear me all right?
You can now. If you stay in that angle, that's fine. If you...
I'm so sorry. It's not a very good laptop. I think there was no choice. Over the last 30 years, 40 years, we've discussed this, at sort of clerkly level between the parliaments of the UK endlessly. And you did indeed have Justice 1 and Justice 2, as I recall. And I see you've now divided it with the criminal justice in one committee and civil in another because of the amount of legislation you're getting. But I would really I'd slightly warn against cracking up the structure too much, because I don't think the structure in the end is what makes the difference. And I think the question you have to ask yourself is, does the Scottish public get a good deal from you for what it spends on the committees in terms of when something is coming up, they want to know what the truth is. Are you getting at it? And I think you do need to keep that autonomy. At Westminster, the autonomy, as Meg has described, is, in my view, far too great. And they've really lost all connection with the chamber. And they've gone off on their own. And sometimes select committees, highly funded, go off and do inquiries into child migrants to Australia, which take an entire year to complete. And absolutely fascinating stuff. But it's what Mr. Taylor and the journalists should be doing, and not a select committee at public expense. So are you, when people are saying what's happening about your bottle collection scheme or whatever, do they turn to the Scottish Parliament committees and say, well, what are they saying? Which is why, and this is my point, the audit function is always seen annoyingly to all other committees as the most brilliant, because week after week they pour out heavily, closely focused, highly critical, unanswerably true reports on the ferries or whatever, and they then become the story. And it's really annoying for the other committees who don't have the backing of National Audit Office down here and Audit Scot. They don't have that backing, so they can't produce that sort of impact. So you mustn't expect too much. But coming to, I just personally think the mixture of the legislative and the other being inevitable. And the question is, are you using the spare capacity in your committee which is non-legislative, wisely. And I've looked through what you're all meant to be doing now on the 16 committees on the website. And to be candid, some of the stuff is more blood raising than others. And I'm just wondering if, members are saying, no, come on, we know what we should do. What are people talking about? We must find out the truth here, or whether they're too cautious. I hope that wasn't too candid.
No, candid is good. I was wondering if anyone in the room was wanting to follow up on any of the themes that we spoke about there. Anyone? You don't need to.
No. Just a brief comment. I suppose connecting this back to the earlier conversation, I think given the many different ways to think about effectiveness and the different roles that committees have, I think it is really fundamentally important that the convener and the members have a discussion around what they actually want to achieve. And it surprisingly doesn't happen as often as you'd think when I've observed committees, that they do go off in lots of different directions without really having a plan or having an idea of what they want to get out of it at the end in terms of the kinds of impacts that they want to have. And I think more thought could be given to sort of being systematic about which areas they want to focus on.
Okay, thanks. I know we've covered a bit of this already, but I know that we've already spoken about the tight legislative timescales that the government places on committees and the sort of conflict that causes with some of the inquiries you might want to do. And it may or may not impact on the quality of legislation. So these are global, we've said, and based on political trends. So I was wondering if there might be scope for I don't know how to say this. How could committees influence some of those challenges when where the stuff is thrown at us, and sometimes we just have to accept that that's what we have to look at, and addressing some of the things that are live issues that the public are expecting us to be talking about, and that might be part of the conflict and the lack of trust because we're out of touch because we're not dealing with what's that live issue going on right now. Does someone want to come in on that one? Brian, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes there is a role simply for ventilating the issue. You don't necessarily have to reach a detailed conclusion, as Sir David said, spend a year investigating some no doubt fascinating topic. But sometimes I think there might be a role, because there's no revising chamber here in Holyrood, the committees have to get it right the first time on legislation, and that is an enormous burden placed upon you. I think the pre-legislative scrutiny is done relatively well, although on occasion you can have a tendency to wheel in the usual suspects. Perhaps on occasion it would be better to get individual views as well. And I believe there's a beginning of the idea of post-legislative scrutiny being undertaken. And in that you could be tackling the very topic you're mentioning there, which is bringing up the concerns and anxieties of individual members of the public, of groups of the public, in order to see whether something is working well. Government will always seek, governments everywhere, executive governments everywhere, will always seek to shape matters to their own intended hue, and they will try and influence the committees in that regard, and pile the work upon you. You have to try and begin with a sceptical approach to all legislation. Is it necessary at all? And in the pre-legislative phase, and then strive to get room for to ventilate, even just to give a single evidence session to ventilate a particular topic in order to get it through. You mentioned just briefly the issue of media coverage. It's sometimes said that the media has a responsibility to project and cover parliamentary matters, and I accept that to a certain degree, but I would add the very strong caveat that the media will only cover things that have two factors, that they are new and they are significant. There can be things that are new that are not significant. There are things that are significant that have been heard before and therefore are not new. But if something meets those two criteria, that is what we're actually looking at. We have a responsibility to cover Parliament, yes, but it is not a responsibility to the Parliament. It is a responsibility to those who are watching, listening and reading our output elsewhere. So the responsibility is always to the people, and that fits in with your idea there of perhaps responding to public concerns and public anxieties. But hey, don't kick yourself too much. I think the committee system is doing, in terms of the CSG comparison, is doing pretty well. It is still the engine room of the Parliament. I mentioned the Dundee University hearing. I could mention the Finance Committee investigation into the National Care Service, which posed persistent questions and had a real impact. Don't kick yourself.
Thanks. So David
So
wanted to come in, I think, and then that'll be
Yeah,
me,
that's fine.
convener.
Well, you were asking, and I'm sure, I mean, Megan Mark will have lots of ideas.
If you could
as
move
well.
to the middle of your screen so that it seems to be better with the microphone. Thanks.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. I'm sure Megan Mark, we all have ideas how to make committees better. I think how to make more out of less. There are two short answers. You want to consider the rapporteur system. It has its weaknesses. In other words, that you have a single member responsible for an inquiry and doing some of the quote work on it themselves and then bringing it back to the plenary of the committee. It has, and again, over the decades, we've all been around the European parliaments and tried to see how it worked. And it's not quite what it seems. But nonetheless, it does mean that you don't have to have always the whole committee involved in everything. And the second simple bit of advice is pay someone else to do the work for you. I know there seems to be a sense that you've got too many commissioners and so on, but there are lots of people out there who can do legwork for a committee and then bring the product to the committee as long as they've been clearly commissioned as to what it is they're supposed to do. And of course, that involves money. And I don't know if the SPAP is awash with funds. Certainly, our House of Commons Commission wasn't. But that is one way you can make limited resources run a bit wider.
Thanks. Convener?
Thank you. Rona, I think you wanted to just come in.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I just wanted to, before we move on, just to wind back a wee bit to what we first started talking about, and that's committee structure and suitability of members, etc. So, as a Chief Whip of the Party of Government, it's my responsibility to place people onto committees. So it was just to say that generally, and where possible, that's done in a way where you take into account the members' background, interest, suitability. It does have its problems because I totally agree with Sir David, who said there are some committees that people don't really want to be on, but they have to be, they have to be populated. Our system works in the D'Hondt system, which means that the largest party, that's the committee structure in terms of the number of members. We have a finite member of backbenchers, generally, and in our party that's about 34. And most of those members are on 2 or 3 committees a week, and we only sit for 3 days. So we also have a packed legislative schedule, which doesn't leave much time for some of the things that you've suggested. Professor Russell, you talked about the Justice Committee. So we do have 2 Justice Committees. I sit on one of them. We have a Criminal Justice Committee and a Civil Justice Committee, Civil Justice and Equalities, which is working well. But, where possible, the logistics are quite difficult just to get the perfect mix of committee structure and members. I always try to get a gender balance on a committee where possible, because I think that's really important. But it sometimes just simply isn't possible. So I just wanted to point out those things, and I know that my colleagues will agree with me. It's not just relating to my party; it's to all parties, and we have a much smaller pool of people that can populate committees and do the work which we really want to do. We much prefer to do a lot more post-legislative scrutiny and pre-scrutiny. But time just doesn't, and time and numbers just doesn't really allow. Thank you.
Thank you, Rona. I want to move on, I suppose, to the next stage, which is the expectation and whose expectation of committees should we pay attention to. So I really wanted to start with what is the academic understanding and what is the actual academic knowledge about effective committees, the effectiveness of committees, and the members on it? Or is this a sort of iterative area of study where we've made reference to some very substantial reports in the past that have looked at lots of different committees? How well do we understand the questions that we're asking? If I come to you, Professor Meg Russell, first.
Sure, that's a very good question, and Academics do their best, but I'm not sure it's ever possible to completely understand these things. I mean, as I say, I have expertise of a sort of broad comparative kind and then quite detailed expertise about Westminster. And I suppose I would say that what I read in the comparative literature is often actually a bit wrong about Westminster, because when you know a place well, some of the generalizations that you read in the literature don't fit very well. And legislatures generally they're all very different. You know, I'm aware from what was just said, you know, I'm obviously aware when I talk about things that the Westminster Parliament does well, they don't necessarily translate into a different parliament, particularly a much smaller parliament. You know, one of the things which is quite striking about Westminster, the House of Commons, is just how big it is. And therefore, you know, there's lots of work that can be pursued at the same time, whereas you're under much more pressure in terms of member capacity. But there are also important cultural differences between different places. So I think there are a series of things written in the literature about what makes committees effective. And I think that the designers of the Scottish Parliament are probably pretty well aware of some of those things. You know, you don't want your committees to be too big. You want them to have a part from the early stage of the legislative process. You know, we're quite unusual in Westminster in bills having a plenary reading before they go to committee. It's generally understood in the literature that it's better if the committees get the bills first. You want them to be well resourced. You want to encourage expertise and evidence taking, these kinds of things. The designers of your committee system took account of those things. But I think it's also really important to emphasize that structure can't really trump culture. It certainly struggles to trump culture. And the classic example in the literature is that post-war, the committees in Japan were in the Japanese Diet were established to very much shadow the kind of structure and powers that the American congressional committees had. But they operate in a completely different way. While the congressional committees are seen as being very strong, the Japanese committees are seen as being very weak. And that's because of how political parties interact with the committees. You know, the political parties, I think, are much stronger in Japan. They have this series of pre-meetings where everybody arrives at the committee with their kind of party brief. And then, you know, the committee itself isn't really doing much cross-party work and engaging very much. So it's really hard to generalize, I would say. I think you need to build whatever you build with sound understanding of your own system and the culture in your own system and its capabilities, not think that you can import something from somewhere else or pick it off a list of what comparative academics think are the effective things, because it may or may not work in your case.
Can I pursue that then slightly? Because one of the things I'm interested in is, you know, what are the influential drivers on committee operations? And I think, you know, both yourself and Mark have talked about, in essence, relationships, the politicians that sit on it, irrespective of how they got there. But we also have our standing orders. We can instruct committees to operate in. We've hinted, and there's been a discussion about the role of conveners. And also the government and the party balance. Do we understand anything more than the sort of just look at it and see what's operating there, rather than if you have a stronger set of standing orders, if you have a stronger separation between government and committees? Is it just the people? Is it the relationships? Or actually is there something about the framework that can assist the relationships and the groups? I don't know who wants to take that. Terrible question. Terribly framed question, anyway. So, David, if I came to you, because, I mean, your experience of that sort of interrelationship between the rules and the members.
Yes, thank you, convener, as they say. Yes, I mean, let's look at some of the things that drive it, and as Megan has mentioned, and Mark, one of them is, I don't know if we've talked about this, one of them is money. Resources is the polite way to put it. But do you have a lot of staff? Now, that will be a very different committee when you have a lot of staff. one of the reasons that the post-1979 Select Committee system was so different to its predecessors was that it was properly resourced. Although, having started in on it in 1979, I didn't feel it at the time. I just had half an assistant. But now committees have staffs of 7 or 8 each, which is extremely expensive. But one of the reasons is that success breeds success, and they talk themselves up. And we were hugely helped by the press, who kept referring to select committees as powerful all-party committees. And that sort of created its own momentum. Only occasionally has someone said, on occasions, the emperor has no clothes. So I do think one of the important things is your own self-confidence as committees, and particularly as conveners, as a group, that you talk up the system as being independent, fearless, interrogatory, even though you know it may sometimes fall short in your own minds of that high target. So that's the powers. The second thing, I'm a bit skeptical. I'm not sure that, I mean, select committees at Westminster over the years, through their liaison committee, the conveners committee, have sought more powers. But by and large, I'm not sure that they really needed them. I mean, the powers to summon witnesses, powers to administer oaths. I mean, some of that is theatre, and which is fine because politics is theatre in part. But I'm not sure that the powers and the standing orders are really a big bit of it. And as Meg and others have said, the underlying culture, and I would say the self-confidence. If you keep saying these committees matter, they will. In Japan, they don't. I've seen that. And in some other countries, members don't realize how good they are. And that may be a case at Holyrood. I remember attending a meeting years ago of the Mongolian Public Accounts Committee, Ulaanbaatar. And the people were very apologetic. They're saying, oh, David, you will find this all very amateurish. And, we know we are not like your Public Accounts Committee. And it was magic. They were laying into 2 government officials on some forestry scheme. Thanks to the interpretation, I understood that. But it was just great. They totally got what a parliamentary committee should be like. So don't underestimate the fact you may have got a good bit of it anyway.
Mark, do you want to add to that?
I think most things have been covered. I think what I would emphasise is actually a point that was made earlier by Sir David about sort of the wider ecosystem or external research that is at your service essentially for committees to do scrutiny as well. I think I can't remember where I read it, but in Westminster the committees are sometimes described sitting at the apex of scrutiny, and they have sort of all these other systems or structures or institutions and organisations underneath them as well, which exist to support scrutiny in the public domain. And I think that perhaps this is an area where the Scottish Parliament could also think about sort of the wider ecosystem in terms of how that can support effective scrutiny, and making better use of or more use of external organisations as part of that.
Meg, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I was just struck when David was talking about public attitudes to the committees and how things become self-reinforcing, that I think a really big, a really important part of that at Westminster is the conception that these are very non-partisan, cross-party bodies. I think that's a key thing that gives them a very different public image to Parliament in general, because I think that, and I'm not sure I can back this up with hard evidence, I think it's more of a hunch than hard evidence based on surveys or whatever, but I think that the public like it when politicians come together on a cross-party basis and it can't be presented as sort of scrapping and party point scoring. And so I think building up that image is good to enhance public support for the committees, but also in itself is likely to become self-reinforcing. You know, if the public like that, the committees want to keep generating it. And I think that what Mark said earlier on, and that what he said in his written evidence, very soft, subtle things, which might in themselves not actually be terribly popular because they also involve resources. Things like visits, where committee members can get to know each other as people, not as just party politicians, can actually be very important to reinforcing that, I think. And it relates to the stuff that I was talking about as well, about doing things where you are powerless. You know, if all you're doing is looking at legislation all of the time where there are entrenched party positions, it's going to be quite difficult to build those cross-party bonds. Whereas if you are able to get onto some of the other stuff, the investigative work and so on, and leave the party politics at the door, then that's good for the outputs. But I think it's also good for the public image and good then for building up the committees in the way that David has referred to, that the select committees at Westminster have that image.
Thank you. Brian, you wanted to...
Journalist, I covered Westminster from 1980 to 1986, so I was probably one of the ones that described the new committees as powerful and all-party, so apologies for that. I remember the select committees with joy and interest, but I also remember at the same time the standing committees on bills, where there were trivial, pointless amendments submitted by opposition parties while members of the governing party sat and languidly did their correspondence and paid no attention whatsoever. I don't think you want to go down the road of that division once more. I think that this Parliament deliberately got away from that to try and create committees that had expertise and a standing of their own, not just in the investigative field but also in the legislative field, and I think that is very important. It's important to consider that legislation is not solely a thing that government does and the rest observe. It was intended that committees should instigate legislation if necessary, that there should be members. Legislation should be suggested perhaps by members of the public, as is done through the Petitions Committee with mixed success, but I believe also with success. With regard to how the committees enhance themselves, I don't think, I'm with Sir David on this and indeed Meg, I don't think that is a structural matter. I think it is cultural and personal. I think you get back to the objectives of the CSG to build an expertise firmly within the body of the committee on a wider basis. And you have, I think, the starting point, as I mentioned earlier, towards legislation is not, should we let this through in this form and should we let the government have their way? You should start from a sceptical, quizzical point of view as to whether the information, whether the legislation is worthy at all. Mm-hmm. And that would perhaps be a reminder to government that the legislation is not solely a matter for them, it is a matter for Parliament and people.
But if I push on that in one area, so what is the role of the spectacle of politics that we do sometimes see in committees, and we certainly see in the Chamber, but in committees? What are the advantages, disadvantages, the role of that, the importance of that, from your point of view, Brian?
I think it is an opportunity for Parliament to reflect the popular concern, the points that Sue was asking earlier, that people will see that their Parliament, the committees of their Parliament, are reflecting, raising and discussing and addressing, at least addressing, if not resolving, the concerns that they have on an individual and collective basis around the countryside. I agree also that the point that was made about the idea of working together appeals to the public. I have lost count of the number of times I've been told by members of the public, why don't they all just sit down and sort it out? And I point out gently to them, they don't sit down and sort it out because they have fundamental disagreements. You don't, for example, solve the question of capitalism versus socialism or the union versus independence by a group hug and a rendering of Kumbaya. There actually has to be a degree of give and take. But as long as you confront these things and as long as the public see, the people see their Parliament addressing their concerns, I think that is more advantageous than a structural reform would be.
Yeah. I know, David, you want to come in, but just before I bring you in, are we therefore really talking about a description of a committee where, rather than every politician who sits on the committee bringing their vested interest, it is actually about a development of a team that can sit behind the committee identity to sometimes potentially, and there's two of us sitting here, defeat the whips, but certainly more importantly, just be able to put aside the party politics and use the strength of the committee as an institution to be able to justify why perhaps difficult decisions are made. Sir David, if I can come to you on both that and the previous point.
Well, on that point, yes, I'm sure everybody would like the idea you can put your party politics aside when you enter the committee world. But I mean, it's unreal, isn't it? I mean, you're not such divided personalities. At least you weren't, convener, when you were at Westminster. I mean, maybe you've changed. I mean, of course, you're elected to do that and to push to join your party and so on. I think one thing that was said about what the press follow, and it has to be new and significant. Maybe just to be provocative. Sometimes they also like it to be secret. And one of the weaknesses of the Scottish parliamentary system is it's extremely transparent. And that's why journalists don't want to write about it, because they reckon it's not an exclusive. In the old days in Westminster, the public bill committees, then known as standing committees, they met for many years in private. And people took a real interest in what they were doing because they couldn't get in to find out. But as soon as they got in, interest fell away. I'm just saying that, but sometimes private evidence is the way to excite people. In a sense, I think what one area that, looking at what you're doing, is the output is maybe not as interesting as it might be. I see this afternoon you're debating a committee report in the plenary on salmon in fishing, not fishing, salmon industry in Scotland. A really interesting subject, presumably, I mean, particularly in Scotland, but to lots of people. But the motion just says it's noted the report. I mean, how deadly is that? So years ago, we suggested that committees should draft as part of their reports a maximum 200-word draft resolution, which would then be put to the chamber, which Meg will remember we tried to do with the Right Committee report itself. And the government hated it and wouldn't bring the draft resolution forward because it set out in our terms exactly what we were recommending, and would therefore oblige anyone who was against it to put down an amendment saying why that they were against that particular bit. But that is what the Europeans do. I mean, every European Parliamentary Committee, EP, but also national, they produce draft resolutions, far too long and boring. But if you have a limit on them and say, this is what we're saying about salmon, because I'm interested, I look at the website and I have no idea what the committee says about salmon. I can't, 2 clicks away and I get a huge report, and that's just dull. So one of the reasons, and this, sorry, very long, one of the ways that you get members to begin to be happy to put aside their some of their party affiliations and working together, as Mark says, visits is great, of course, but it's difficult to justify in itself, but is that they enjoy the work they're doing. And that is, and there are various ways of doing that. It's partly about theatre, but to get some joy back into it. And my final suggestion is that you ask those people who are your regular witnesses. And I know you've put out a request for, I'm not sure that they will respond. So I spoke to a very good friend of mine who appears in front of Scottish Parliament committees quite often. And I promised this person anonymity. I said, have you ever been asked by anyone how it went? No, he said, never. He gets a diversity questionnaire after the appearance, and that's it. I said, what is it like? And he and those people, others, he said, the questions just seem to come out, the answers happen, there is no discussion, unlike the one we're having now. There's no discussion. The reports often miss the key points, and they get virtually no exposure. Now, I don't know if that's true. And he's doing this for a living, representing whatever. But that's quite depressing that no one has ever asked him or his types, how do you think we could do better for you? Because you rely so much on them, which when you see a much poorer country, you realize we are entirely reliant on civil society to produce witnesses and tell you what's going on, not just the government. You need all the institutes of this and the trade unions and people coming to you. So that they are not just your clients, they must be treated as your partners in a common enterprise in which they play an important role.
I think you can I was going to say to Sir David, you can reassure your friend that probably questions are already in the post to him. I'm going to do that thing as I'm convener and I'm speaking, so I'm going to remind myself and conscious of time. Meg, can I come to you and then I'll pass over to Annie, if that's all right.
Yeah, very quickly, and I'm taking us back, I'm sorry, to a conversation that was happening a few minutes ago because it's rather moved on, but you were talking about leaving party politics at the door and whether that's realistic and so on. And it just occurred to me it might be useful to throw in a term which is a very nice term, I think, which came from an academic called David Arter, who was based at Scottish University. He coined this term, wrote an article about committee cohesion. We talk a lot about political party cohesion and how political parties work as teams. And he was writing about committee cohesion and what can help to make committees cohesive. And it was some of the things that we've talked about before in terms of, resources and size and not having too much fast turnover and all of those kinds of things. But I quite like this idea that on the one hand, you have party cohesion and on the other hand, you have committee cohesion. Some people in the literature have presented committees and parties as being kind of in opposition to each other, that you have these two possible forms of organisation, either the parties or the committees. I don't think that's right. And I think there are examples of places, Germany, I would say, as an example, where you have very strong parties and very strong committees. I see David nodding. I know Mark Geddes knows much more about Germany than I do, but I don't see them as being in conflict with each other. But I think thinking about establishing both, having cohesion in your committees so that people feel part of a team in the same way that they feel part of a team in parties is a kind of sweet spot if you can achieve both.
Thank you. Annie, can I come over to you?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everyone. Going back, we've sort of touched on the public perception of what committees are. And Brian sort of hit the nail on the head, I think, when he said it's got to be something that's interesting at that moment in time. But do you think the public's expectation of us is more of a reactive thing? And I think what Mark said as well about getting out there and actually seeing people. I've been in committees now for the last 9 years and I've seen the same people sit in the same place, doing the same evidence sessions. And we're still back again, and maybe 4 years later we're getting them back in. So how can we say to the public, this is what we're doing, and be more effective at including them in the discussion? And I know a lot of work's been done by the Outreach Department in Parliament, but I still think we miss it a bit. Brian, maybe yourself first.
Just again, glancing back at the CSG, the McLeish team report, they envisaged that it would be common for committees to meet elsewhere in Scotland rather than just Edinburgh, and I don't think that has proved to be the case. I understand the obstacles to it. I understand the objections that would come of trips around Scotland, but I think that could be advantageous. I do think you as you allude to there, you need to broaden and deepen the range of evidence that comes before you, not just the familiar stakeholders and interest groups, although absolutely critical though they are. On the question of rapporteurs was mentioned earlier. Again, I was looking back at the CSG on that. They left it kind of open. They said they concluded that standing orders should be left sufficiently broad to allow but not compel these, but talked about the idea of there being rapporteurs that could engage on an expert basis with the stakeholders and the groups in that occasion in an effort to gain consensus prior to the inquiry taking place. So that is again also something that could be undertaken. I think the committee cohesion point is an excellent one. That's exactly what is required. Is it to be seen as a parliamentary role? I know it's impossible to leave partisan politics at the door. It's not realistic in complete time, but it is an objective to be aimed at, perhaps, and I think the idea of committee cohesion is a good one. As to what the public expect, I think they are still slightly baffled and amused by the parliamentary system generally and by the committee system in particular. But the more people have engagement with it, I always find that they welcome it. They arrive apprehensive and they leave perhaps not with Sir David's sense of joy. It'd be rather difficult to, the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee inquiry into committee effectiveness. It doesn't just resonate joy, does it? It doesn't sing joy. But I absolutely take the point that forgive me, convener, but it does. Joy is in my heart. But it is a very good point that if you have committee cohesiveness, if you have a determination to reach a collective view perhaps in as much consensus as possible with as many stakeholders and members of the public as possible, then that in itself is a joyous endeavour.
Thanks, Sir David. Do you want to come in, Sir David? Oh, no.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned outreach, which is terribly important. I'm always nervous. I'm nervous about the phrase by now. It tends to be Parliament trying to shout at the public, telling them what it's doing and what it believes and what it's done and so on. I think the more successful approach is in-reach, which is not a word, and I've asked outreach experts what the word is giving the public, and the smaller the country, the easier this should be, a chance to tell you what they want you to do, and what they want out of it. And that is possible. And I think your Petitions Committee, and I have to say also the Westminster Petitions Committee, but I think your Petitions Committee does that. I mean, I see it's doing an inquiry into the delays in the dualling of the A9. Well, I mean, that is an issue of presumably massive importance to people in Scotland, and indeed people like me who travel up there. I just think it's very good that there are systems by which the agenda in the Parliament and in committees cannot be set, can be strongly influenced by the public in sometimes unexpected ways. I mean, obviously some petitions are more valuable or worthwhile than others. And the second thing is, which I know you're also doing, I think on drugs, I may be wrong, but on the citizens' panels idea, which now everyone is doing, which doesn't mean it's a bad thing, and government is doing, and every quanga is doing. But I think if you're producing a subject, if you're looking into a subject of sort of widespread general interest, I think the Parliament sponsoring citizens' panels is long overdue.
Anyone else on that one? No? Yeah? No. The other thing as well is, obviously, we have alluded to the media. How do we as committee structures in here actually encourage the media to come and actually sit and see what we're doing? How do we use social media better? To actually, because I feel myself, before I get elected here, I wouldn't have known what the committees in this Parliament do. I wouldn't know if they were government, if they were Parliament, if they were what their actual role was. Now that I'm here, I understand what it is, and I think the important part as well is it's like if you're passionate about something, you will put more effort into it, and you will then focus a lot of your efforts in the committee that you're in at the time. But if, as Rona said as well, if you're just put into something, how can we get that over to the public that we are passionate about the role of the committee we are in? So,
training at this point.
The media would get a kicking eventually. It was inevitable. How do you get more media coverage? How do you be interesting? Have something to say.
Yeah.
But once again, new and significant. But I do take the point about the public having an interest and taking an interest in the committees. In my experience from the very early days, stakeholders in Scotland felt they had to go through some sort of conduit and sideway, and I said, just phone the clerk. Just speak to them, speak to the clerk, speak to the members, speak to the convener. They're open to ideas if you've got something to say. So perhaps it's once again just make yourself available in that regard to the public and the stakeholders, and they'll take you up or not as otherwise. Don't expect a rush to match the opening of the Citizens Theatre in Glasgow, for example. No. But you'll get a degree of interest, I'm sure. People when you take yourself seriously and work hard and in dedicated fashion, folk will tend to appreciate that and reflect that. They'll never thank you, by the way. But
Rona, can I have a simple slip to your set of questions, I think, now. So hand over to you.
We're on
Yeah.
to media. Okay.
Yeah.
Just before that, can I, just on the committee cohesion thing, just going to make a shout out for the Criminal Justice Committee. We are putting through 2 huge pieces of legislation just now, and I would say we're acting as a team. And we're putting through the Domestic Abuse Homicide Review Bill and the Victims, Witnesses and Justice Reform Bill, which are hugely important, and we want to make good legislation. And I think we're putting party politics aside and we're all working together. So, I mean, that's, you know, I wish more committees did that, but just wanted to say that point, and I agree with you about committee cohesion. So yes, so in the media, as a former journalist, Brian, I'm sort of dying to ask you questions about, I mean, we know how things have changed in the media.
Yeah.
So I kind of wanted to say, how has social media changed the, you know, the landscape for how you report and what you report?
I believe that social media has made have made a huge impact upon what is sometimes disparagingly called the mainstream media. I must confess I'm not an expert on social media. I believe I have a Twitter account, which was set up on the day I retired by my younger son, and I think there's one tweet which was goodbye and thanks for all the fish.
Yeah.
And I will do another tweet, I've promised, on the day that Dundee United win the European Championship.
Yeah.
So that's any day now after Sunday's result. But I do know that social media is critically important in gaining. If properly used, I believe it can be advantageous. It so swiftly descends into vitriol and unpleasantness that I think perhaps its use, unfortunately, in the way it operates is limited. In terms of the mainstream media, the newspapers, broadcasters, etc., I can only repeat what I said. You have to be new, and you have to be significant, and you have to be interesting for there to be a degree of media attention. We cannot simply turn a story around just because the Parliament thinks it's important. If you think about that, that's the antithesis of democratic scrutiny. There has to be something of substance to the recipient rather than the progenitor. And so I still feel that, but I do feel perhaps that we are slightly neglectful. The media are not in the numbers that they were. The numbers of political journalists is declining because of financial cost constraints, and therefore there's perhaps less attention paid. But there's still organisations, still newspapers, certainly still the BBC, STV and ITV Border, paying attention to those committees that they believe have a relevance to them. But it has to be a relevance to the recipient, again, I stress, not a relevance to the committee itself.
So on the new and significant point, and I completely get that, you know, does that mean then that the news is distilled into pretty much a snapshot or a headline now for social media? In the days when, you know, gone by, where you might have seen some in committee and went, you know, I could do a good that. There's something behind that, and you would do more of an actual feature on it or a piece.
Yeah.
You don't do. I don't mean you personally, but
no.
you know, media don't do that anymore.
It is still done. My colleague and friend Kirsten Campbell did a piece on the Dundee University appearance, which was a substantial packaged story on reporting Scotland, and I know for certain it was little bits were put out during the day on social media. I can only speak from my only experience is 30-odd years, 35 years at the BBC, during which social media became more and more important. And the objective, we got into the habit of thinking of getting a story out there quickly on social media first. So it was online first was the phrase we used internally. So you got it on the BBC website first, and then you considered the method of covering it for radio structured programmes, for the television structured programmes. But you would think about these things. It's not secondary. It's at the same time. It's simultaneous. But the first object is to get a line out on ahead of the others. Frankly, on social media, online. What is now, you know, the website in the case of the BBC, rather than other forms, but other forms as well. As I stress, I'm not a great expert on the use of social media, and that I tend to eschew it altogether. But there we are.
I think Meg would like to come in. Sorry, Meg.
I was only going to say something that's probably rather obvious, which is that there's a balance to be found here. So obviously, the media is tremendously important to committees in getting them profile and get their message across and get their conclusions heard and understood. But at the same time, and I think David will probably smile and nod if I say, because he'll know some of the examples I'm talking about, there have been times with Westminster committees where maybe chairs have tried a little bit too hard to focus on media above substance and content, and maybe pulled in some eye-catching witnesses or launched inquiries on things really with a view to attracting the media. So I think it's substance needs to come first and media needs to come second. And there is a bit of a danger that too much focus on pulling in the media can lead to sort of party political grandstanding and so on, and push against some of the other things that we've been talking about in terms of working together as teams and wanting to focus on the sort of proper detailed scrutiny of stuff rather than just the headline grabbing stuff. You need both, but don't take it too far.
Thank you.
Gemma, did you want to?
I was just going to mention, obviously, as Audit Scotland, we produce a lot of quite long reports ourselves. We have recently put ourselves a page count that we're not allowed to go along. But I think we are now kind of increasingly realistic about the number of people that will read a report from start to finish. That will be some of our stakeholders who've got a real interest, but a lot will not actually go beyond the first page of the key messages, or actually just not open the report at all. So for us, it's we've got a brilliant comms team in terms of thinking, well, how can we then get those messages out to the wider stakeholders and to the public? So thinking about how can we use social media, we use much more kind of bite-sized interviews, we use animations, little videos, because kind of people will watch about 5 seconds of those animations and then scroll on past. So I think you have to be realistic in terms of how much actually people will engage. But I think what it does force you to do is to be really clear about the messages you're trying to get over, because you've got 5 seconds to get somebody's attention. So essentially what you need to be there really clear is very quickly boiling it down to what are you trying to say, what's the key message, what do you want people to know about this? And that's not necessarily how you would write your full report, but that's what you've kind of essentially to get that essence from it in terms of what do we want people to know and what do we want people to do with this, and then give them links in terms of where they can go for further interest. But it certainly does change, I think, in terms of kind of, for us, it's certainly made us think in terms of we have to change the outputs that we're doing. Yes, absolutely, that 40-page report will still be part of the suite of things that we do, but there are other products now that we want to put out. So, for example, we try and do where there's an area that's got a lot of data, how can we make the data interactive for the public to go in and find out about their own local area? If we know we've got something coming out on a particular region or area, how do we engage with the media in that local area to make it so that that area which might not make national media, but for that area that it will get picked up, and therefore the citizens in that area will be able to kind of interact with that report. So it's widening thinking, I think, in terms of the traditional way of doing things doesn't now suit the way that people consume media and interact.
Brian, you wanted to come in. Can I just add, before I invite you back in, should we be looking at media coverage then in respect of effectiveness of a committee?
The only point I was going to make was that Meg makes an excellent point about the changing nature of the media. You can consider how you attract the media coverage using them as a conduit, but of course in the current system you can go directly through your own methods of publication and getting out to the public that way. How much they consume is of course up to the public, but as long as it's kept digestible, as was ably explained there, then I think you can do it without requiring the conduit. I hate to put my own dear colleagues into redundancy in that regard. I certainly don't mean that, because there is always a role for intelligent, thoughtful and detailed appreciation and acknowledgement of what is going on via the media, who will make a point of comparing perhaps the finding of a committee with some other point that has been made elsewhere by government or by Parliament elsewhere. So I think the media will continue to play a critical role in terms of scrutinising the work of committees, but just don't perhaps expect too much is the guidance.
So David, did you have a comment before I hand back to Rona?
Yes, I quite agree. Just very briefly, no stunts. There is a stunt.
Again, do you want to centre yourself slightly on your laptop?
I'm so sorry.
Perfect.
I am. The thing is that no stunts, and we haven't got onto the issue of directly elected chairs, but the two things are not completely unrelated, and you do have a danger of people mounting stunts. Secondly, huge shout out to our National Audit Office and to Audit Scotland for infographics, and the old days when 50 years ago I started writing select committee reports, you wrote it all out on pieces of paper and someone typed it up, and that's all gone. And the way in which you can convey information other than verbally is now so important, not just because of social media, but partly because that suits them. And I think the audit people have sort of led the way in very, very clear infographics. And if the SP doesn't have an infographics advisory officer or whatever, it should get one.
Oh, we're ahead of the game on that. Well, we're up with the front of the game on that. Joe, did you want to come in? Sorry, Brendan.
I've been hoping that someone would raise the directly elected chairs. I think you almost said it earlier, Sir David, and I think potentially when we're talking about how the committees get increased self-confidence, higher levels of esteem, potentially that, and perhaps paired with financial payment for convenerships. Currently our conveners do hugely hard work and get no financial reward for that. So I wonder if you think that those two things which happen at Westminster do help the committee structures there have that increased esteem in the eyes of the public and the media.
Well, shall I start on that? Obviously, Meg and I have history on this from the Right Committee. Look, I was sceptical about the idea of the directly elected chairs. Back in 97, 98, the McLeish group and all, I don't think it's breaking a confidence to say their original proposition for Holyrood was that the chairs would be nominated by the Bureau, which seemed to me, and I was part of the UK input of this, and a very bad idea indeed. I was convinced that the best thing for a committee is to choose its own chair, its own convener, because then you trust them. And you know who they are, they're one of you, and you've decided, and you will support them, having voted for them. That may be naive, but that had struck me in 20 years working on committees as having been the fact. I was concerned at the risk of celebrity chairs, and we have had a few, who are simply parachuted in on a sort of ego trip and fall out with the members of the committee. But actually very little. It has been much less than I expected. I also didn't believe that the parties would be prepared for the rest of the House to decide which member of their party took a committee. So if it's a Labour committee, I was pretty confident the PLP would want to say who the chair was, rather than letting the Conservatives decide which Labour member chairs a committee, because that seems against the, maybe tribal, but the party's own nature. So I thought there wouldn't be many contests. But on every count, I think I was wrong. There have more than 50%, I think, except for 2019, but regularly in the last 15 years, more than 50% of the chairs have been contested. And if you remove the Liberal Democrats and the SNP, who are at Westminster, are rather smaller groups, between the two large parties, there's nearly always been an intra-party contest, and very vigorous ones. So members of the same party fighting one another very publicly. I mean, politely, but publicly. I think it means the chairs are more confident, and I know Mark has done research on it. It's very difficult to prove, but they have become more, they're much more visible. People say, what does the chair of the committee, of the X committee think? And indeed, you don't normally have to wait to ask, because they're out there telling you what they think. They have their own press apparatus, virtually, and they've become perhaps too big for their boots in some cases. So at Westminster, we do have we put in the removal mechanism precisely to deal with the celebrity chair who'd fallen out with their membership. Now, Meg will probably, I know it's been it's been effectively used once, although not voted, recently on the Defence Committee when the chair resigned because he was about to be removed under this bipartisan mechanism. But I think it means that there was whip interference in the old days. It didn't always work, but the whips did know who they wanted the chair to be. Now, I don't think whips are wicked. I mean, they run, they're a necessary, I can't see so, but they're a necessary part of parliamentary life. But they interfered too far in removing popular chairs or ensuring they weren't put on the committee. And I think it has overall led to an increase in committee effectiveness as well as visibility.
Mark, do you want to comment on it?
Yeah, sure. I think Sir David's covered the main points, actually. So I suppose I could just reinforce some of those. So the research that I've done looked at where I interviewed chairs and committee members after the process of elections was introduced. I interviewed over 40 MPs and staff. Not a single one said anything negative about the process of introducing elections. Maybe there's a bias in terms of who was willing to be interviewed, but I think that does say something about the faith that people have in the system, and that collectively at Westminster it's seen as a positive change, where chairs view themselves as more confident and more legitimate. It's enhanced their role and their confidence in order to speak on behalf of the House on the particular issue that they've been elected on. I think that's absolutely the case, and it's therefore also strengthened more widely the independence of the system as perceived by the media and the public as well, I would argue. And there's a debate about the extent to which that it's led to an alternative career, which I think is also often a point of interest in this. But it certainly is the case that several chairs have said that they have more prominence and argue to have more influence as a result of being a chair of a committee in Westminster rather than being a junior minister. So I think that does also matter. So I think that's perhaps just reinforcing the other points. But overall, I think it is led to an improvement at the system in Westminster.
Thank you. Meg, I'll come to you, and then Brian.
Great, thank you. I think the previous two speakers have said a lot, and I won't repeat that, but I agree with all that's been said, I think there. I was going to make a couple of additional points. Somebody mentioned committees electing their own chairs, which obviously is the way that we used to do it at Westminster. Of course, when it was changed by the right committee changes, we sort of switched the order. So the chairs are elected first, and then people put themselves forward for the committees in the knowledge of who the chair is going to be. So it's rather unlikely that you'll get something that's set up right from the start with the committee members not approving of the chair, because if they don't like who the chair is, they don't have to put themselves forward for the committee. Although, as David says, obviously things can break down. I do think it's worth considering, and I'm pretty sure you have considered, the difference in dynamics between what I emphasised earlier is a very large parliament and your parliament, which is very significantly smaller. I mean, David said some of the smaller groups in the House of Commons have not had contested elections for chairs. And of course, all of your groups in the Scottish Parliament are smaller than the groups. I mean, the main party groups are smaller than the groups at Westminster. So I think there is a greater chance that you have uncontested elections. And there is always the opportunity, in a sort of worst case scenario, I suppose, for there to be a kind of whip stitch up where the whips go round and say, well, right, you're standing and you're not standing. And it's hard. This is, again, an example of how culture and structure kind of butt up against each other, and it's difficult for structure to trump culture, because if that's the way the parties want to do it, it's difficult for anybody to stop them. But I would say that at the very least, having elected chairs, and I think all of the things that have been said about, accountability to the whole chamber, feeling a sense of legitimacy, feeling you're representing the whole parliament through having gone through a whole parliament election, I think is really important. And at the end of the day, if there's sufficient unhappiness inside a party about the person who the whips have encouraged to put themselves forward, then somebody else will put themselves forward and maybe they will be elected. So even if it doesn't happen very often, I think as a kind of check on the power of the whips and the parties to control everything, it's a very valuable thing. But it might not work in the Scottish Parliament quite as it does at Westminster due to size questions.
Thank you. Brian.
Up on that latter point that Meg made there, I think that there are advantages to elected conveners. They would enhance the status of the convenership and thence the status of the committee. They would perhaps reduce party power to some extent and also perhaps governmental power to some extent, although I would think there are limits to that given the desires and demands of parties and governments to control matters. The slight concern I have is that if you have an elected convener with enhanced status, it might set that individual at a degree of remoteness from the remainder of the committee and might counteract the desire for committee cohesion. But I believe that could be got round by on the part of the conveners and the committee, the personal and cohesive links being sustained. I would just be concerned very slightly that you have the star performers that Sir David talks about, and perhaps therefore the cohesion of the committee is reduced thereby. But with that caveat, I think it could be an idea well worth looking at.
Does the concept of flipping the selection, if you do conveners first and then draw on the committee, do you think that answers that challenge that you put there, Brian, or do you think it's... About
Meg's knowledge with regard to the way it works in the Commons, I'm not sure that would make all that much of a difference, because the point that she also makes about the relatively few numbers that are available in the Scottish Parliament means that the opportunity to pick and choose is perhaps much more limited.
Thanks. Sir David, did you want to come back, and then I'll hand over to Joe for the last part?
Yes, and I know we're running short of time.
Or again, can I ask you to centre yourself on your excellent laptop?
The alternative career question that we haven't, which you raised and we didn't answer. I do think that the payment of chairs is actually quite an important symbol. Gwyneth Dunwoody, and everyone we speak of, it tends to be dead, but dear Gwyneth said that she was so annoyed by it, she thought of it as a tip. Although it was quite a large tip. But we knew what she meant, that they were still being paid less than the most junior undersecretary in a department. They were, I think, going to be rising towards a Minister of State, but not quite. Does it mean they have that they refuse ministerial office? No. This is one of the oddities. I lost 2 successive chairs from Defence to be Ministers of State, deeply upset both times. Chris Mullin became an undersecretary at the Department of the Environment from having been chairman of the committee. It loathed that so much, he came back and got himself appointed to the chair of another committee. So they'll still, members are human, they'll come and go, and it's difficult to turn down a ministerial job. But I do think it has become not an alternative career. I think that is the wrong way of thinking of it now. I think it's part of a general career in politics, includes a spell as a select committee chair, and there's no disgrace in then going back into being a Secretary of State or a Minister of State and then coming out again. And most of the examples I can think of are still alive, so I have to be careful. But as so few people watch this programme, we can think of Mr. Tugendhat, whose career, and I'm sure he won't mind my using him as an example, you know, he goes perfectly comfortably between being a representative of backbenchers and then being a minister and then being not being a front bencher. And I think there are more and more members like that. And I think that's what would happen also in a smaller jurisdiction.
Thank you. Joe.
Okay, thanks very much for that. That's really helpful. So the kind of last area I was wanting to focus on was the impact of scrutiny and audit work. So we've touched on it a couple of times already. So I guess Jim would maybe let you start off, just giving us Audit Scotland's experience of evaluation work and start the discussion on on audit scrutiny?
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. I think a lot of really relevant themes have already come up today. Essentially, what we wanted to do is we knew we had part understanding of what happened as a result of our work from different data sets, but we didn't have a holistic view of what that looked like, and we didn't know what we didn't know either. I think when we started, we were clear actually that we needed to be clearer on a definition what impact was. So, for example, some people talked about what happened in the media, our attendance at Parliament, committees, that kind of thing. Some people were talking about were our recommendations implemented, and the third part of that, though, is then, but what's the bigger change that happens as a result of our work? And we were clear that actually we needed to measure all of those, and some of that is much easier than others to do. So, for example, our kind of media activity, we can very easily get download numbers into activity. We can very easily get that. We did quite a lot of work in terms of our recommendations and how we could systematically follow those up. That's led to some really interesting work in terms of clarity of recommendations. So I think, again, what we found was that actually when we looked back at our summer recommendations, we'd say to ourselves, oh goodness, even we don't know how we'd follow that up, because what did we mean? So that's led to kind of really clearer guidance for our teams in terms of the recommendations have to be specific, they have to be measurable, they have to have an idea in terms of the priority and the time that we would expect something to happen by. And what that means then is that now we kind of interact with the public bodies to get a follow-up plan, essentially, so that ourselves and the stakeholders are really clear in terms of what change do we want to happen, what do we expect to see as a result of the recommendation, and then we're clear in terms of timescales and when we'll come back to follow that up and what evidence we'll expect to see in terms of that recommendation being implemented. The recommendations are always management responsibility, so we don't own those recommendations. They go on to be, the responsibility of management and that public body to implement, and essentially it's their kind of policy choices in terms of how they are implemented. So we are very clear in terms of, well, actually, this is the type of change we want to see, but we don't prescript exactly how that should be done. But that's led to quite a lot of interesting work for us and reflection in terms of actually just how we do our recommendations and how we systematically follow them up. I think the harder things for us to measure are the more qualitative aspects. So, for example, we're really clear in terms of that actually not our impact doesn't just come through recommendations. So we know through our audit work that we have a lot of influence just in terms of sometimes we say we've got an interest in an area that can have an impact before you even go and do any work, but also that through the development of our relationships with those public bodies and people in those sectors, how we kind of approach an audit and talk about an audit and build that relationship through the audit process can make a huge difference in terms of how those recommendations are implemented. But also the kind of types of work that we do in front of parliamentary committees, for example, groups of stakeholders, professional groups. We're very visible in terms of talking across our reports and not just about product-specific reports, and that's much harder to measure. What we are doing at the moment is essentially kind of doing a bit of a mid-term evaluation. Again, sorry, just to say what we were really clear on in terms of is that we needed to have an idea of where we wanted to go. So that point in terms of, well, actually, you need to be clear about what you're measuring kind of your impact on, because you need to, have an idea of what direction you want to go in. So we were really clear in terms of setting out outcomes that we expected to happen as a result of our work, and to gather our data to see, well, actually, are we meeting those outcomes at all? So we're doing an evaluation at the moment, which is helping us look in terms of not just the kind of quantitative evidence that we have, in abundance, really, and making sense of that, but also looking in terms of, well, how can we build that link between some of the softer sides of what we do and put a piece, essentially a trail together in terms of, well, how does that link to the outcomes, to allow us to see. For us, it was really a lot of it was around about that continuous improvement. So how can we know, if we know where we're having an impact, then how can we do more of that and do that better? But if actually we think, oh, actually we really want to do this, but actually our work isn't delivering on that, then actually we need to change direction and do something different to make sure that we have the impact that we want, and also that our stakeholders are expecting from us. So it's a bit of it's quite a journey to go through, and we're absolutely not there on it, but it has been really illuminating in terms of kind of, I suppose, where to place the emphasis on your work, and how small changes actually can make a big difference as well.
So just before I bring Brian in, because earlier Brian touched briefly on post-legislative scrutiny, so I wonder if you could give us just your thoughts on how some of what you've learned as Audit Scotland might help the Parliament do some of that. And then Brian obviously raised it briefly.
So I suppose, I think for us, it kind of comes back to us being clear about what it is that we're looking at and what it is that we want to achieve. So what did we expect to happen essentially as a result of this, and how can you start to then build that evidence case in terms of, well, what does that look like? And over what timeframes would you expect to see change? And for, a lot of the recommendations that we make, particularly around about public service reform and bodies working together, we know they're not quick fixes. And again, kind of what we can kind of see in terms of the implementation of our recommendations, we can start to now see the speed at which change is starting to happen, which things are what bodies can implement quite quickly and quite easily, and which actually take a number of years for change to start to happen. And so what, again, we're trying to be clear on is, well, OK, we wouldn't expect to see the final product in 18 months' time, but what would we expect to see in terms of the start of that journey towards change? So I think that's an important thing in terms of just sometimes expectations of how quickly change can happen, and what are the markers along the way to allow you to see, well, what is progress happening, and is that good progress?
Tiny thing to mention from my experience as a journalist covering politics over umpteen decades, we in the media and politicians generally tend to move on rather too rapidly to the next caravanserai on the route, while the public are still sitting behind, baffled and bemused by what has just taken place, and are anxious and concerned about what has just taken place and need that explained to them and need that expanded upon them. The public are right, the media and the politicians are wrong. They are right to take things slowly and to take a cool, calm souk with regard to these matters. And that's where I think post-legislative scrutiny could have an advantage. I understand that the work programme is already hugely demanding, and this is a suggestion for yet another element, but I believe it's being done by some of the committees already. It could be asking how the proposal that went through the committee in the first stage has worked. Has it worked as intended, or are there negative and damaging consequences? Is there something that needs to be looked at again? And again, once again, that's made more critical by the absence of a revising chamber. In the absence of that post-legislative scrutiny, it is left to valuable organisations, such as Audit Scotland, to take sometimes a fairly sharp and harsh look, rightly harsh look, at some of the mechanisms of government. It's perhaps something where committees could have a role as well.
I guess one of the questions, if the committees of the Scottish Parliament do more of that, there's a concern about fatigue in terms of witnesses. You're going back to people who've, you've gone through the legislation, and then you go back, and whether there's a concern. Meg, have you got any thoughts around?
I'm not sure if I've got any thoughts on that. I do have some thoughts a little bit around this area. Certainly in terms of committee follow-up, I mean, exactly as Brian said with respect to the media, I think committees, this was one of the flaws that we pointed to in the committees at Westminster, although that was a long time ago, and I'm not sure how much they've improved things since, is the tendency to do an inquiry, put out recommendations, and then just move on to the next thing and move on to the next thing, and never go back and evaluate the success of that inquiry and how it's going. So I think that's one thing. And obviously what Gemma was saying was very valuable, and there are quite a lot of parallels. But I think I would want to draw the distinction between two different things. One is follow-up and the success of your recommendations. Obviously, you make recommendations. Have they been picked up? And that's something that some time, ideally, within the resource constraints, should be spent on. But not seeing that as the measure of your success. Because, as I said right at the beginning, committees do an awful lot of other things aside from making recommendations. So checking whether your recommendations have been followed up and what's happened is a good thing, but the measure of success of committees goes much wider than whether recommendations have been implemented or not.
Yeah.
Anybody else looking to?
Excellent. Wow. Oh, David. Yes, Sir David, sorry.
Yes, I think the weakness, excuse me, the weakness with post-legislative scrutiny is that it is legislative, as if all that mattered was legislation. And I think the most successful committees, when they've looked at a subject, their recommendations and conclusions are often misconceived, out of date, will rapidly be dismissed by government as something that's already being dealt with. But the problem doesn't go away. And I think of the Health Committee at Westminster, which has a wonderful record. It looked at obesity years ago. Its recommendations were disregarded to some extent, but year after year, they do return to the subject. And gradually, I don't think we're getting less obese. But it wasn't legislation that's going to help very much. Some legislation, but to keep coming back. If you think a subject is worth looking into now, it is worth coming back to regularly, even if all the membership of the committee has changed. And that is the problem, of course, is the new membership says, what's all this about? And isn't interested. So I think there's a slight danger in post-legislative scrutiny is that you're just looking at legislation.
I think you'll find that some people who return to committees in different sessions find still the same questions hanging in front of that committee that's been viewed previously. I am slightly conscious of time, but I do want to finish just by asking for a sort of snapshot around one word that we've talked around but hasn't actually been spoken out loud today, which is the concept of trust. And where that should lie and which way it should go. So I will gently look around the panel to give you a couple of seconds to consider that. And maybe if I can come to you first, Meg, trust. How does it lie? Where does it lie? And how should committees respond and maybe stand up to that requirement?
That is a very big question.
That's why I left it till the end.
I'm not sure I can come up with much beyond what's already been said. And while I'm blathering, other people will be able to formulate more concentrated thoughts, perhaps. I think that this is maybe connected to some of the points that we've raised. The idea of elected conveners who have the authority of the Parliament, not just their political party, might be an enhancement to public trust. Committees that present themselves as serious and focused on detail and important issues, and not on political point scoring or sort of jumping on bandwagons to get publicity, hopefully gain trust. I don't know. I'm sorry. I feel very unprepared for this question. It's a very tough one.
No, well, I'm not going to apologise for the toughness of the question. Should thoughts come to you afterwards, please come back. Brian, if I can come to you.
I would make a comparison with the work and endeavours that I tried to do within the BBC, for whom trust is a declared objective. Mm-hmm. And the way I think that we tried to secure trust with the public was to ensure that they were always on their side. And I mean that literally, a question of standpoint. Where are you standing? So when you are covering, and I mentioned this to some extent earlier, when you're covering a parliamentary or political event, you should not ask the question, why does this matter to X party or Y government? You should be asking yourself, why does it matter to the people to whom I am broadcasting? And as long as you are asking yourself and you are trying to answer the question, this is important to you, listen for a wee second, here's why it is important to you. And I think if committees are to adopt the same broad principle of saying we are investigating this to find out why it matters to you, what difference it makes to your life. We are on your side in that search for answers. We are not on the side of even our own committee, of Parliament, and certainly not of the governing executive. We are on the side of you in trying to seek answers and information and disseminate information as well. As long as you're doing that, then I think that is the way to win and secure and maintain trust.
Thank you. Mark?
Yes. Thankfully, I did have a couple of moments to think whilst I was talking. So I do appreciate that. What I would say is, I suppose this whole session was about this topic, really, without really talking about it. Building effective committees is about rebuilding faith and trust in politics, I think, fundamentally. And some of the other topics within that similarly talk about this. So when we're talking about media attention or media profile or public participation, all of that is about rebuilding faith in our democratic process. So I think that that's really important. For that reason, the final thing that I would say is also that the diversity of evidence matters, the diversity of who participates in these processes matters, to build effective committees, but also to rebuild faith and trust in politics. And that's also why I think the diversity of the committees themselves, which I think we touched on earlier, is also really important, because the diversity of committees themselves, in terms of the members, ensure that decisions are made more effectively, but also more legitimately in the eyes of the public. And I think that will help to rebuild trust as well. So I think that there's lots of different dimensions that we've spoken about, which are indirectly about trust.
Thank you. Gemma?
Yeah, I mean, trust, it's so important, and actually what we found kind of through our evaluation work, it's a thread that runs through all of that in terms of kind of us being effective and having impact. I think for us it kind of runs through the importance we put on building relationships, both with the kind of public bodies and our stakeholders, in terms of being able to build that trust, being clear about kind of, I suppose, our role, our independence, our role in gathering evidence, but also being relevant, so that when we are looking at an area, we're clear in terms of that it's relevant to the stakeholders in terms of the scope that we're looking at, who we are listening to, and who we're speaking to about that, so that people through our processes have trust that we are gathering the right evidence from the right people and coming to the right conclusions and presenting that in the right way that will make the change that is required. And at all points it's building that trust within that, in terms of both kind of the softer side of things in terms of the relationships, but also hardwired into your processes in terms of that kind of trust and transparency through that. That's what we've kind of, I suppose, have found through this work. Actually, there's a huge part to play in effectiveness and impact.
Thank you. And finally, Sir David?
Well, I'm not sure if I've had too long. There are a couple of things. One, any parliament would kill for the reputation and trust that we have in the BBC, and we don't have it. No parliament does. But that is a very reasonable target, and it's a really interesting thought to say, do the public trust more what they see and hear on the BBC or what they see and hear in the Parliament and its committees? And I think we know the answer, but it's a good target. Secondly, committees were originally individuals, in that word, to whom a task had been committed. In this case, by the plenary, by Parliament tells its committees, this is what we want you to do it. So part of the trust is Parliament in its own committees, that it has to hand off stuff to them and trust that they will do the job they've been told to do by the Parliament really well. And I think that's why you want to be effective. You have no existence other than to all your colleagues who are, in one way or another, trying to become part of a trusted part of the democratic process. So I think those are my only two insights on that word.
And your two and all of the insights from all of the panel today have been both very valuable but also incredibly interesting. Can I thank you all for your time this morning? If there are any thoughts, and particularly with regard to Meg, of dropping you in at the deep end with that last question first, if there is anything that you would like to add to coin Brian's phrase, just phone the clerks, as a way in, can I thank you very much, and I will close the public part of this meeting.